Welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Well, thank you, John. I'm excited to be here.
So I hear your son's quite the app developer. So what has he developed?
Oh my God. He is so technologically oriented. He's just in the teen. And I think AI has opened this brand new world of opportunities for kids who are really analytical and love technology. So he actually participated in this contest called Presidential AI Challenge. So middle school kids all over the country are participating in this challenge where they want to have to use AI to solve a societal problem, like a community problem. And so, what him and his friends did is that they created a website called Safe Routes AI. And so, their problem is that many students walk from home to school. And often it's not safe in terms of like the lighting is not right, or, 'cause some corners are dark, or traffic is not great. And so they're kind of taking this user input data and feeding it to the website. And this is sort of for students to map their best route, the walkers to school, and for their parents to have like a calm mind when their children go to school.
So you started, if I understand this correctly, you started in engineering in Indore, India. So it's almost like the apple's not falling far from the tree here, right? Because you really started down this path, but really started quickly to look at the contradictions in companies. So tell me a little bit about the moment you realized that organizations don't really have clean engineering solutions. That you also started really early on in your career, just like your son. You were very creative.
Yes. Actually, it was not until I began my PhD that I really realized that, like you say, like organizational problems are not really clear cut, and especially kind of the kind of problems that I was interested in related to climate change and related to inequality. And like you said, I spent several years in a software company in India. I was an engineer before that, and all of this before I came to get my PhD in the US. So I was kind of bringing all of that instincts and skills to the PhD program and really kind of immersed in numbers in first year of my program. And this was like my familiar kind of stomping ground. And I was really trying to quantify decision making and as one would solve an engineering problem. And I remember we had this center at Case Western Reserve where I got my PhD in Cleveland, Ohio. And that center's name was Business as an Agent of World Benefit. And that just stopped me in my tracks, when I encountered that phrase and encountered sort of the purpose of that center and really like questioning, shaking my belief of like what business can do in this world and how can it be really a part of the solution and not just part of the problem. And so once I started to dig into these complex issues, such as, how business addresses climate change, et cetera, I realized I must kind of embrace this complexity in how I need to conduct research and the kind of questions I'm asking and the kind of tools that I'm bringing to research. And so, like I would say, engineering kind of gave me this instinct to look for patterns in data, which is very valid right now as well and very comes in very handy. But research truly gave me kind of the space to sit with complexity and kind of not rush past it and not try to quantify everything.
It sounds like to me too, though, that India has really influenced your research, that you still look back to your roots and in coming up with your questions. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, India has really kind of stayed with me, in the way I understand business and the way that I look at the world. And often when somebody asks me that question, their mind is in kind of the inequalities and environmental issues in India, and all of that is fair. But I also want to start by saying how gorgeous India is, and it's full of culture and it has brilliant people. And in fact, if I were to show you like a photo of my small, teeny tiny town on a regular Monday, you will be struck by how beautiful it is. So I just want to make sure that we realize how much potential India has. And at the same time, it has a lot of inequalities and a lot of issues. And when you kind of grow up like fish in water, you don't really understand fully the extent of how much these issues are within the social fabric of the country. And so it is really since I started my um, kind of journey as a social scientist, right from my dissertation, I decided that I'm not going to decouple myself from all the learnings and all that the context has to offer, and instead really embrace it. So, for my dissertation, just to give you a quick example, I studied these 5 business NGO partnerships. So, an example would be, imagine a beautiful town at the sea, at the coast, and there's a luxury hotel there. And this hotel would partner with an NGO, a nonprofit organization, who worked with sex trafficking victims, and they would kind of run a laundromat. So for a hotel, their linens have to be clean, like that's the most important customer experience. And yet, they decided that some part of that they're going to give to this nonprofit. And, you can imagine all the complexities that come with it. So I did some 48 interviews across these 5 partnerships. I stayed in the field for many weeks. I followed the people who were really in the thick of these partnerships. So I would say that it was really right from that moment, like beginning of my research program, that it was just so evident to me that our current theories of organizations that are mostly kind of created from this Western lens, from Western data, they do not really travel freely across context, as we may presume, So if you think about a tension between a hotel looking for this like cost and quality, and this NGO providing jobs to women who have court cases to show up to, who don't know like what professionalism means in a workplace, who rightly cannot trust each other. So what does teamwork really mean in this case? And so it's not a straightforward tension to navigate. And so we can't simply just resolve this tension. It requires sort of this really deep contextual understanding and almost like sort of this cultural, response to this kind of tension. So that I think India has given me sort of this opportunity to push forward our thinking and really kind of, poke at our current theories that we probably take for granted.
So let's talk a little bit about that thinking. And I was so excited to talk to you because I teach as well. Most of my students are graduate students, but you actually teach freshman business at Kogod. And I was just excited because I know today students are coming in with this sort of belief about business. But what do you want them to walk away with from that class that they take, their first business class they take in college?
Yeah, I feel so privileged to be able to talk to our students, spend their first semester, first year, sometimes first college class ever with them if I teach an 8 a.m. class. And I feel like it's such a gift, because they show up with so much hope and excitement. They're beginning their college career, and I feel like I can play like a small role in telling them that there are many ways that a business can be in the world and kind of what role can they play in that. So to answer your question, I think most students arrive believing that either business is all about profit and anything that they do outside of that is just window dressing. Or they feel like, and this is more and more now, that they feel like that business is just fundamentally broken. Like our system is broken and the business can never be a force for good. So my hope is that by the time we finish that semester, that they leave kind of holding a third possibility, right? Like that there is a tension between these two views. And that tension is where all the cool and interesting work lives. So I want to introduce them to interesting and transformative businesses that are really kind of navigating this paradox rather than ignoring it or collapsing it. And these businesses that are really not asking either profit or purpose, but they're really asking, how do I do both? And they're like some of the business leaders I want to bring into the classroom and be talked to in my classroom are not only wanting to do both, but they're honest that it's a very hard work to do both. And, B Corps is a great example. These sometimes very small businesses voluntarily choose to undergo certification of their business practices. And it's a very rigorous certification. Only about 3 to 4% of those who have taken the certification actually get certified. And yet, many of those want to push even further. They want to contribute to the movement. They're asking what's next. And so all of this are possibilities that often get lost, if you're really not in a classroom interrogating, kind of imagining what's really behind, what probably we just hear as a casual observer. So at the end of our time together, I just want my students to leave with this sense of responsibility. Like businesses do shape the world, and they shape the world that these students inherit. And these students don't have to be like a passive kind of audience to business shaping the world. These students are the next, generation of business leaders, and it's up to them what kind of leaders they want to be.
So we're going to dive deep into your research, but I don't want to leave this area first until we talk a little bit about your approach because you brought up B Corps, but you actually bring these into your classroom, right? You bring the B Corps and social enterprises into that classroom environment. Talk to me a little bit about your approach there.
Yeah, I think again, as a social scientist, as an educator, to me, research that never reaches practice has so much potential that is wasted. We invest so much public money, private money, years and years of our time in publishing these articles, creating these insights, and if they don't reach practice through the classroom or through other means, I think there's just so much potential that's wasted. And on the flip side too, like if decision makers and businesses always only make decisions based on their intuition or anecdotes, I think they make mistakes that research insights can help them avoid. So uh, I think both parties have to gain from collaboration. But having said that, their worlds are set up in a way that sort of the gap between the academic world and real world management impact, like that gap is, truly hard to bridge. But I think it can be bridged. And so for me, it's not just inviting these business leader to kind of validate findings after the fact, but it's also about like building questions together and testing and building theories together. And even when you've published, how do you stay in touch and, how do you help them use it? How do you help them think through it? All of that is so important when we think about research or we think about our teaching. And specifically for teaching, I love to bring B Corps and social entrepreneurs in the classroom and really for my students to see that these individuals are living the paradoxes that we study, and that the frameworks that I'm telling to my students are not just sort of these abstractions, and they're like actually uh, challenges and opportunities and tools that these businesses use. And oftentimes, these business leaders in the classroom enjoy this experience so much that they also leave with new vocabulary and new ways to look at the problems. It's a win win if we make the effort to bridge the gap.
You found what you call a paradox of inclusivity. Can you tell me about that? What does that mean exactly? That was a significant part of your work in 2025.
Yeah. So, kind of the TLDR short version of that is, we found that companies that get certified on their sustainability practices should be most open to inclusion practices because inclusion is a big part of sustainability if you think about sustainability broadly. However, these companies also, we found that they leave the what we called as the B Corp movement when the movement asks them to go further because inclusion is not part of their strengths. So let me kind of unpack that a little bit. So, B Lab, which is a nonprofit that runs the B Corp certification, it launched something called the Inclusive Economy Challenge that ran from 2016 to 2019. And what they did is that they invited the certified B Corps to voluntarily take on this additional challenge related to inclusion. So, in terms of pay equity or who's in your leadership team and so forth. And the good news is that our data show that B Corps that participated improved their inclusion practices. They definitely um, went up vis-a-vis where they were before the challenge. And even better news is that it was not just inclusion practices, they improved overall their sustainability practices more broadly. And if we change the level at which we're looking at these data, there were also spillover benefits at the movement level. So the entire B Corp community, especially those who were joining after the challenge, were already kind of ahead in these practices. So that's all good news. But there was also a twist. So the B Corps that had kind of like strong environment or governance practice but may not be the best in inclusion practices, were also most likely to leave the B Corp movement entirely after the initiative. So, not just opt out of the challenge, but just feel that they don't belong in this movement. And I have to also say here is that this challenge was just one part of all the other signals that B Lab was giving around how important inclusion is to the movement. So it was sort of this whole array of signals that these B Corps were receiving, and their strengths and identity lie somewhere else rather than inclusion. And they felt that this is probably not the movement for them. So the paradox that you referred to here is that this very act of the movement pushing for more inclusion kind of created that this exclusion dynamic within the movement. So that we thought was interesting.
Okay, so it seems like most academic research today looks at sort of historical evidence, but you kind of argued for a different way of doing this. You want to talk a little bit about that?
The idea comes from our prior work around knowledge co creation. So let me kind of draw this line of sight for you. So this was around 2020. We developed this process and a logic, obviously building on prior work around this notion of knowledge co creation. And I did this with my mentor and friend, Tima Bansal at Ivy Business School. So we conducted about 67 interviews with researchers and managers who had worked together in these collaborative partnerships to co-create knowledge around specific sustainability issues. So we did those interviews, and then we also observed two projects over the course of 8 months in real time to get, because sometimes interviews can be retrospective, you miss certain things. So observing these two projects in real time helped us fill some of those gaps. So we found a few things, and I want to quickly tell you those things and then transition into our current thinking around co-creating forward, if that's okay. So we found a couple of things. One is that, as I had said before, researchers and managers come from different worlds. They speak different languages. They have different time frames for work. And all of that has been said several times. And it was very evident in our data too. And at the same time, we found a few ways that successful projects could navigate these differences. And there were three specific practices that they followed. So the first was that these successful projects used visuals, instead of text, instead of using a lot of text like reports and documents. And what those visuals help them to do is they help them transcend discipline specific jargon that both researchers and managers use in their fields. So this object framework visual in front of them help them transcend their language and kind of almost operate in this third language of visuals. And that was really helpful in pushing forth their differences. Second, we found that decentering research expertise is very, very important. Society as a whole affords a lot of expertise to researchers. If you are in a knowledge partnership, Everybody kind of looks to the researcher to give the answers. And so successful project led by researchers were those where researchers could decenter that expertise. So what did that mean? That mean that researchers presented their work as work in progress, not as defending final answers. They expressed uncertainty. And all of that made these managers kind of fold their sleeves and lean in instead of just like sitting back and listening to the right answers from the researchers. And then finally, whenever there was a logjam, when they could not agree, the researchers and managers, what broke that logjam was referring to the mutually agreed outcome. So, looking at the end of the project, the excitement of outcomes that they will create that both parties decided, and bringing it back into the present conversation pushed them forward. So those were the practices, and it kind of really helped us help academia and research in many ways by presenting this in various forums, publishing it, and hoping that researchers would use some of that in the research practice collaboration. And then, it was around the time our paper came out, and COVID was just around the corner, right? So obviously, the world stopped, and like most people who had more time than usual in their hands and very kind of, reflective time, we were wondering about the limits of this kind of process because COVID showed us, and I feel like now AI is showing us that we cannot answer questions or problems that we don't even have the vocabulary for yet, right? So, how do we look at what's happened in the past to answer questions or problems that have not emerged yet? So, we started poking at the limits of this idea of co creation and hence came up with this notion of co creating forward. And here is where I also want to kind of take a slight sidebar and talk about this research practice initiative that Tima has started at Ivy Business School around systems thinking. And a lot of these ideas of co creating forward came from our work with 25 Canadian companies through that initiative. So, what does co creating forward mean? It means that how do we look forward with practitioner rather than solely relying on our theories, on our historical evidence that's looking backward. And we found four ways that we could do that. One was that we anchored in a constantly evolving tool. So, moving from frameworks that are static to tools that are action oriented and making sure that these tools are presented and treated as continuously evolving, which means what? Which means that you take your focus from now to how this tool will evolve in the future. Um, we also found that these kind of co-creating forward process was organized around a well-defined outcome, but the process of getting there was flexible. So researchers took a lot of many different roles. They were problem solvers, they were scientists, they were participants, so it wasn't fixed role. They were kind of shifting their roles, and that was really important to create the space for this kind of looking forward and imagination. And we specifically designed many future horizons. So there was the project, there was the life of the tool, there was kind of systems change in the horizon. So by specifically designing multiple future horizons, we took our gaze from the past and present to really looking forward. And the last thing is, and I love this phrase that came out of some of that data, it says, interrogate possibilities, not probabilities, right? So, not just being stuck on what historical evidence or even past experience of the managers can do, but together imagine, kind of almost getting unshackled a little bit from that and imagining together. So now that's where our head is, that I think some of our biggest pressing problems can be, we could start to study them at the systems level and otherwise by kind of, using these really imagination and other tools as part of our toolkit.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the most intense field work you've done. Your team, let me make sure I get this right. conducted 103 interviews in the garment industry in India. You talked to labor contractors, workers, employers. You found people from the communities. In fact, I would say that you found people that were historically untouchable. Um, they couldn't really even advance when they held the same job title as their upper caste. So tell me a little bit about what you saw on the ground. I want to hear about this work and this invisible wall that you found.
So, like you said, when we entered the field, there were a couple of things that were really evident. And this was large. I also have to give credit to my co author, Vivek, who really trained the research associate in the field who were the local PhD students and local researchers. So, we did not compromise on contextual kind of understanding. So what we found was that if you look at the same job title of a contractor, a labor contractor, um, eh, they were doing completely, the way they were doing work was completely different, and the outcomes for them were completely different. And how would you explain that? Uh, so let me just tell you about like who we were studying. So we were studying a labor contractor in what's called Tirupur knitwear cluster in India. And these contractors are supposed to be sort of this labor market intermediary, right? So they recruit workers, they supervise their task, they get paid by the employer, and then they pass that pay to the workers in return. So if you look at our sort of Western language and theories, these people would be boundary spanners, right? Like they're spanning the boundaries between the employer and the employee. And our theories of social capital and everything else will say that these people are at the most advantage because they're spanning boundaries. They can really leverage their skills for, advantages. But if you overlay a caste lens on it, in practice, it's completely different. So, what we found is that these upper caste contractors were operating through a dense network of community trust, like our theories would predict. They could get better rates because employers knew them or their family because they belonged to the same caste. They had financial buffers because their family had money that they could lend to these contractors, and just like the shared social ties with other upper class people gave them just huge advantage. On the flip side, the Dalit contractors were doing the same task, but in kind of completely different social environment. They had no informal social capital like you were referring to. They were actually physically excluded sometimes from spaces where often these deals were made. Sometimes their leadership was questioned. So if an employee was a higher caste than the Dalit contractors, the employee would often question the contractor's leadership and not listen to them. And we also found that because of all this, not a single Dalit contractor had sort of become an employer, had a factory, or was part of the industry association. So again, same job, completely different outcomes depending on where in the social hierarchy you are placed.
So a couple things came out of the research when I was looking, and I would like you to talk a little bit about them and explain them to me. Um, one of them was physical space as a mechanism of exclusion and something called the zero statistic. You want to talk about that?
In India, space almost encodes caste. So even today, in many places in India, probably not our generation, but at least our parents' generation, lower caste individuals cannot occupy the same physical space as upper caste people. And I say that sometimes to my friends here, and it's almost unbelievable for them to get their heads around that that's a thing. But it is very much a part of the caste system in India. And so it has sort of implication for what we were calling in the paper economic precarity. So imagine a Dalit contractor. He walks into a, let's say, tea shop outside the factory, and the upper caste folks are just sitting. And so it's not just like it's an awkward movement, a social like awkward moment. They're actually almost like risking their livelihood because employers might lose their face if they're seen interacting with a Dalit contractor, so they don't want that. Workers from upper caste communities don't want to work with a Dalit contractor. So, kind of this exclusion from physical spaces, reinforce economic precarity, and the economic precarity kind of also, makes it hard to have access to these spaces. So it's almost a self-reinforcing cycle. And it can, the way I'm describing it, it can seem so far from our global kind of supply chains, but the implications are so significant, because sometimes um, the multinationals or the Western brands say, oh, like we have a code of conduct, we monitor our suppliers, and looking at compliance of wages, working hours, etc. But these cost-based dynamics are almost like operating inside that supply chain, and they're truly invisible to this monitoring system. And a first year a factory can totally pass every audit and yet have this profound inequality embedded in their social fabric of just like producing the garments.
So a lot of your work has really focused on kind of companies doing good and doing work. And they really would often pull in opposite directions. I think you've alluded to that. But one thing that's really interesting is you do not ever portray companies as villains, and it's deliberate. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Because I don't think villainy is a very useful analytical category, you know? And, like you and I actually believe, like most people, including business leaders, are trying to do the right thing under very real constraints. And, so to me, the more interesting question is actually a structural question. So it's almost like, why do these good intentioned people in businesses so often produce, mixed or even bad outcomes sometimes? So then that shifts from a leader is bad to kind of like institutional pressures, cognitive limitations, maybe there are measurement failures that really make it hard for these organizations to act. And if we ask those kind of questions, I think the answers can lead somewhere. It can lead to better institutions, it can lead to better incentives, better measurement system. It can make some change, in the business ecosystem. But if I start from the premise that companies are villains or business leaders are villains, I'm going to kind of closing off all of these possibilities. And um, I think these people are really navigating significant paradoxes, and I want to treat them as partners and understanding what are those paradoxes. And so both of us can learn kind of in the process. But I'll also say here that doesn't mean letting bad behavior off the hook. So before I came to America, and I used to teach at Georgia State, and actually used to teach a course in public policy, and I had no business business student in that class. These were all students kind of wanting to go into public service. And to them, a biggest question for me was that what does that mean in terms of letting bad behavior off the hook? So in no ways am I saying that, by appreciating the structural kind of constraints around them, that we're letting bad behavior off the hook. It actually just means being very precise, like where the failure is. Like, is it individual bad faith? Or more likely, it's in a system that makes like good behavior costly for these businesses.
You became the associate editor of the Journal of Management Studies in 2023, and that's one of the top 50 business journals in the world. So, how are you leveraging that platform going forward?
It's been actually very exciting to be part of Journal of Management Studies. And I was interested in this position because the journal is truly at the intersection of rigor of our research and the societal relevance, of the questions and we ask and answers we provide. And so it was very important for me to support work that is theoretically ambitious and creative, but also practically important. And so as an associate editor, I've had some ability to kind of shape what questions get taken seriously, what methods are legitimate, what issues are central, and so forth. And that has been really quite a treat. Um, and so, as editors, we also get a chance to write editorials. So, one of my favorite ones is a climate adaptation editorial that I wrote with a few other editors on the team. And it was our attempt to set a research agenda. And I think it's kind of illustrative of the opportunities that I just mentioned. I see, being part of this journal. So, in that editorial, we are kind of arguing that climate change adaptation is almost sort of this neglected half of climate scholarship. And we have focused so much on mitigation, especially in management scholarship. How do we prevent future warming? And, you know, uh, we've like mitigation has been the primary focus. And so, how do organizations adapt to a warming climate? And some of that is already irreversible that we have not paid enough attention to that. So, through that editorial, we kind of are encouraging sustainability researchers to don't not see them as intention, mitigation and adaptation as intention with each other, like and not see adaptation as surrendering to what's going on, rather than how do businesses mitigate and adapt to what's happening. So that's just one example of what I think, some of the agenda setting role that the journal editorship allows. Um, and then I've also kind of used this role to very carefully think about kind of which voices go unpublished or have a hard time getting published. And, most of you said top 50, probably most of those top 50 journals are from, North America and Europe. And they're a whole other part of the world that struggle to publish in these journals. So, how can I play a role in kind of trying to bridge some of that gap? And that has been really a very kind of passion project of mine in terms of showing it up in spaces and being on panels and talking to future co authors from non Western parts of the world to see, okay, what does this mean to get published in this journal?
So it's an exciting time to be a researcher. It's an exciting time to be an editor. But right now, the buzzword, of course, everywhere that's shaping our lives is AI. So how do you see AI shaping sustainability research going forward?
I think at the methods level, it's already kind of completely changing what's possible. So if you think of large qualitative data sets like sustainability reports or regulatory filings and so on and so forth, it would take us so long to analyze them and surface patterns. And now, that has just shrunk and it opens up so many questions that we were not asking before. And in fact, and almost this is like the thick of the conversation in the qualitative and sustainability research community right now, that even smaller data sets, which of qualitative work, which we thought would require all this intuition and human interface, and people are asking questions around like how do you involve AI and whose epistemic responsibility is to kind of generate knowledge. So it is a very exciting time. I think it's really shaking everything we had taken for granted for so long. I think for sustainability specifically, we talked about the research gap. I think AI has such an important role to play in bridging that. And let's just think about translation. It's so much faster and easier to take our work and translate it into something that can be consumed by business leaders, which would earlier take us so long time in getting there. Now it can be done in a day, probably. So AI tools bring a lot of that. We have to be cautious. There are biases in AI systems, and if we think about responsible leadership, responsible, actions, I think we have to be very careful, like whose voices are amplified and what are the biases. Some of our students and otherwise are also asking questions around energy use and water use and how does that intersect with use of AI. So I think all these are very, very important questions to wrestle with, and I think there's a lot of energy around them.
Okay, for a student at Kogod right now that's sitting in your class and you're talking to them directly, tell me a little bit about if they're sitting there wondering, can business really be different? How would your journey explain that to them?
I love that question. I If a student is asking whether business can really be different, I will tell them that's exactly the question they should be asking. They should be asking whether a business can be different, not just assuming it can't or assuming it can. But by asking this question, they're ready to do the more interesting work. And so I'm thinking, like I've been studying sustainability for the last 15 years, and in my experience, business can absolutely be a force for good. We have the evidence, we have B Corps improving communities, companies solving problems that public sector can't, social enterprises coming with all sorts of innovations. So it's real, like it exists that business can be a force for good. But also, I would tell them that it doesn't happen by accident and it doesn't happen just because a CEO means well. How it happens, it requires kind of being honest about the tensions and between, doing good and doing well and navigating them deliberately. And some of my B Corp work has shown that it also requires these kind of really strong measurement systems that capture what matters and that fosters future change in behavior. Uh, and i- and I think when we think of tensions, I always use this phrase about this special kind of leader who's who has this comfort with discomfort, you know? So these leaders are not okay with the way things are, but they're also not paralyzed by, the way that things are. They're kind of working in this gap in this creative ways. And they're truly comfortable with being uncomfortable in this gap. And so that's what I want for my students. I don't want them to have this false optimism that businesses are great. I also don't want them to be cynical that businesses are just putting on a face and saying that they're doing good. But I want my students to be in this middle space and be uncomfortable and kind of find the skills as future business leaders to really kind of work with that discomfort.
Dr. Sharma, thank you. What a powerful conversation, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.